A few weeks ago, Emery from the James Bond complex invited me onto his podcast to chat about Anthony Bourdain and kind of compare Anthony Bourdain and Ian Fleming as kind of like world travellers who really had been to all of these thrilling cities. And I felt very inspired by that. So much so that when I was chatting to Ray from the Bond Armoury, he said he was reading Kitchen Confidential. I thought, you know what? Got an Audible subscription. Why didn't I get Kitchen Confidential read by Anthony Bourdain and just go through it? And it was a completely different experience listening to Anthony Bourdain as opposed to reading him, and it was a really, really beautiful way to experience that first major book that he had. I don't know if you're familiar, Anthony Bourdain actually, even though he was, you know, famously a chef, had actually written a couple of murder mysteries before he sort of hit the big time with Kitchen Confidential. I might have to go and read one of those one time. But Kitchen Confidential, what is it? Well, Anthony Bourdain was a pretty successful chef in New York City, and he kind of hit the big time when an article of his called Kitchen Confidential was released. I think it was in the New Yorker. And so many people loved his, like, inside look at how the restaurant industry operated in New York City, that he was given a commission to write an entire book about it, and that is what Kitchen Confidential is. It's a book ostensibly about, you know, behind closed doors, what really goes on in the restaurant business in New York, but it's also a biography of Anthony Bourdain, and it's kind of a fascinating one. Anthony Bourdain came from kind of like an affluent background, I think in New Jersey, and he got into the hospitality business, specifically catering and cooking, and became a chef. And he studied at CIA, the Culinary Institute of America, before going on to become a very high-profile chef in New York City. And it's kind of a wild ride. I don't know if you've ever worked in hospitality, but I worked in sort of high-end restaurants the beginning of my career. I was a bar manager for the Island Hotel on Tresco, where they had a fantastic restaurant, and it was like a hardcore kitchen crew, just like the ones that Anthony Bourdain describes. And it's a wild ride, man. And so listening to Anthony Bourdain read this book, it was great because I could, you know, picture everything, and I could almost smell the food cooking and hear the chefs yelling at each other. And it's such a unique and interesting world to be in. I don't think I could do it again. I remember, you know, I wasn't part of the kitchen crew, and I used to think all the chefs were psychopaths. And I don't know how people managed to cope in that, like, fast-paced culinary environment. But I think some people crave it. Just like, you know, I always wonder why people work in advertising agencies, but the fact is that when you work in an advertising agency, it's kind of addictive, even though it's like ridiculous long hours and things. You kind of enjoy the work. And I think Anthony Bourdain, like, found a real pleasure in it. I think one of the reasons I've always liked Anthony Bourdain is the fact that he comes across as kind of like, I guess these days you'd call it ADHD, but things like a kitchen environment, and my wife, she's kind of ADHD, she works in a hospital environment, these kind of like high pressure environments where things are always changing, things are always coming up, that you also simultaneously leave behind when you leave. I think those are working environments that are really good for a certain particular type of person, and it seemed to work really well for Anthony Bourdain. And his book was great because he has such a beautiful way of describing things. When I chatted with Emery, we talked about his similarities to Ian Fleming, and I think the economy of his verbiage, he says, being very uneconomical with his verbiage. I think Anthony Bourdain's like economy of words is very similar to Ian Fleming's. Ian Fleming had a journalistic background, so it's kind of interesting to see just how much Anthony Bourdain can say with so few words. He's also very good at, like, very colourful metaphors, finding the exact right adjective, so you can say something with one word that most writers would say with like 5. And I guess it's kind of like cooking. You've got, you know, the best food is always the simplest food, and you just pick the, you know, the really perfect ingredients for it. And I kind of feel the same way when you listen to Anthony Bourdain read his stuff, that, you know, he has very, very simple sentences that he just uses particularly select words for to give them all of this flavour and character. I enjoyed it a lot. I will say now I've got to a certain point in my writing career, I can tell why it was a first book. So these aren't criticisms. I mean, I think the thing with a book like Kitchen Confidential is it is just so charming and just has so much in it, and it's almost like a feast to go through it all. So these definitely aren't criticisms, because I don't think you can take anything back from the magic that is Kitchen Confidential. But I found it kind of interesting to look through and see now. There isn't really a structure to the book. You know, there's one chapter which is about him growing up in France when he visited with his parents. And then there's another chapter about behind the scenes of a New York kitchen. There's another chapter about how you can cook food so it tastes like a restaurant. And they're all kind of like separate essays that are kind of structured together until they accidentally make a book. And I think this is a very typical thing for people starting out. When you first write a book, it's more about the exercise of just writing a book. And then the books that you write after that tend to be a lot more structured. And I think Anthony Bourdain's books that followed that tended to have a much more cohesive kind of like statement to make. And it's this really weird thing. I think you can say that Anthony Bourdain's later books were on a technical front better, but they just don't have that same charm as Kitchen Confidential. And it's so interesting when I look back at my own books, I can see that there are so many flaws with some of the first books that I wrote, but just the charm and the enthusiasm and like the passion for it and the simplicity, the naivety of it comes across in spades. And I got that. I think that's why Kitchen Confidential is in so many ways, you know, one of Anthony Bourdain's best pieces of writing, is because it has that naivety, that rawness. Reading it, it's really interesting because he says some things that are definitely meant to be controversial and shocking, and at the same time another thing that kind of indicates that this was, you know, his first real book is the fact that he kind of censors himself. And I think when you read it, you can see, even though he tries to put across this image of not giving a shit, you can tell that he does give a shit to a certain extent, and he's, you know, kind of judicious in the people he names. He's kind of judicious in the people he praises heavily for everything that happened. The other thing that I found really interesting is he's got this weirdly perfect blend of like arrogance and self-deprecation. Like, he admits when he was a jackass. Like, he has this wonderful thing about his second summer when he was working in a kitchen in Massachusetts. I think it is. And you know, he admits that he was like so naive and such a rube and such a pain in the backside. And then later on you can see that he also has this huge self-confidence and he knows how good he is later on. And it's a very weird, very human, very charming thing in his book about how he can be ridiculously arrogant but at the same time very self-deprecating. And he talks about things like his heroin addiction and, you know, problems with drinking and fighting, and times in his career where he, you know, would stick with a sinking ship rather than trying to go off and start his own thing. It's very honest, and I think that's why this book in particular like launched Anthony Bourdain's career, because there's that honesty and that authenticity that you simply can't fake, and it makes for very, very entertaining and addictive listening, and I enjoyed it a lot. It definitely makes me want to read more of Anthony Bourdain's stuff, and I'm actually really interested in picking up a copy of his first murder mystery novel. I think it was was it Bone in the Throat? And that's going to be interesting to see how he tackles writing writing fiction, as opposed to writing something like this, which is more, as I said, just like a series of extended essays. It's really interesting to go through, and I will say I kind of was left a little bittersweet at the end of the audiobook because it was so great. Every night I would be cooking the kids dinner. We went through like a week where every night it was a gourmet food because I was so inspired by listening to this audiobook as I cooked and worked in the kitchen. But it left me kind of bittersweet at the end because it reminded me again of the fact that Anthony Bourdain is no longer with us, and he was taken from us too soon. Even though he was in his 60s, he, you know, he had a tragic end by suicide, and it's really difficult to kind of like get over that. I remember when Anthony Bourdain committed suicide, it hit me so much harder than I expected it to. I was aware of Anthony Bourdain, but then just hearing about him committing suicide, and then the more you study him and the more you see his humanity and his authenticity, it's like these things that we love about Anthony Bourdain were also things that led to him being in the mental state to do what he did, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. It's like the more raw and authentic and honest and vulnerable you are, the more the world loves you, but at the same time that vulnerability can kill you. So I don't know, it's definitely worth picking up a copy of the audiobook. If you have an Audible subscription, I absolutely recommend it. It's a different experience to listen to the author read his book as opposed to reading it and sort of having the words in your head. I know when I used to commute a lot, I listened to a lot of audiobooks. There's one by William Shatner, his biography, and it was kind of fun because it was like having William Shatner in the passenger seat. And listening to Kitchen Confidential on audiobook, it was like Anthony Bourdain was just sitting there smoking a cigarette, telling me these stories as I was cooking in the kitchen. And yeah, it's one of these things, I think, that gives you this weird intimacy and this weird like relationship with somebody who you've never met, who you can never meet. You just feel like for just a short period of time you've got a peek into their life. And I think the thing that makes Anthony Bourdain the person who resonates with so many of us is the fact that he lived a life of sensuality and decadence and realism and taste and experience. It's all very visceral. He would enjoy eating like the cheapest family food or the most expensive food. He just enjoyed the experience. He thrived. He lived and embraced life. And I think that's where the kind of parallels with Ian Fleming come across. I mean, at the end of No Time to Die, there's that Jack London quote where it's like, you know, I won't waste my time trying to prolong it, I will live my life. And it's kind of Anthony Bourdain lived his life. He feasted in everything he did, and I think that's why all of our lives ended up being a little blander for him not being in our lives any longer as a celebrity. Anyway, that's my little roundup of Kitchen Confidential. I thought it was really a wonderful, wonderful experience. Yeah, you've got an Audible subscription, I definitely recommend listening to it. Cheerio, I'll be back soon.